Good morning everyone. Hi and welcome to my Unit 1 presentation. Today we will discuss how Africa's colonial legacy has influenced African security. So here's our agenda for today. I'll start with a quick introduction. Then we'll talk about how we should look at African security, and I'll give you what I think are the important aspects of security within the context of Africa and colonialism. Next, we'll visit each aspect of security and try to draw links between Africa's European colonial history and its current security issues. Finally, I'll present to you my own thoughts and conclusions from our discussions. So note that I have included the references of the articles I have drawn information from at the bottom right-hand corner of each slide. All information should be considered as taken from these reference sources. I'll only give you my own thoughts at the very end of the presentation. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction so you'll know a little bit about the person you'll be spending the next 20 minutes or so with. So my name is Stephen Johnson. I am a U.S. Navy veteran. I've been in the service for about 25 years. I'm currently stationed outside of London in a small town called Northwood. And I live in a small town called Gerrards Cross. I'm a civil engineer by my academic background, but by trade I am a naval aviator. I completed my undergraduate degree in 1996. I finished up my master's degree in 2006. I went to the U.S. Air Force Command and Staff College. I'm currently on my next to last assignment before retiring from the U.S. Navy. And I'm assigned to the NATO Maritime Component Command as the Assistant Chief of Staff for Allied Maritime Air. Historically, the West has looked at security through a state-centric point of view. However, the post-colonialism and post-Cold War world saw a new security perspective come to light. This new perspective reconsidered the traditional concepts of security, which centered on the state, and the Westphalian concepts of state sovereignty. These concepts were replaced by a non-traditional concept of security, which sees the primary threats to security as poverty, health, disease, hunger, crime, and social conflict. Enlightened policymakers and academics now thought of security as an all-encompassing condition. Now, this is not to say that the state was no longer essential to sustained international order or enforcing territorial integrity, but these things are not enough to preserve human security in a globalized age. Security is more than the absence of interstate conflict, but the presence of opportunity, health, and democracy. Human security requires government and social structures which empower all elements of society to make choices about their own security concerns and give people a stake in the state's systems and in their own future. Quality of life challenges are security challenges, and security and development of human capital are linked. The United Nations Human Security Handbook, which is published by the UN Trust Fund for Human Security, lists 7 categories of human insecurity and their root causes. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're only going to discuss 4 of these categories: economic insecurity, food insecurity, community insecurity, and political insecurity. Now we're going to do this because their root causes, in my opinion, can be directly linked to Africa's colonial legacy. So from here, we'll look at what each insecurity category means and how Africa's colonial legacy has influenced each one. So the scope and scale of African economic insecurity is difficult to discuss in one short 5-minute slide. Okay, but towards this discussion, there are quite a few statistics which one can use to measure a state's economic security in its insecurity. Now, of course, a deep dive into African economics is outside the scope of this class, and believe me, I am far from an economist. But I do think it's worthwhile for us to look at an economic metric that I think that we're all fairly familiar with, and that is the gross domestic product. So if we look at the World Bank's 2020 GDP data on sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm going to say consists of 48 states, and then we compare it to the GDP of North America, which I'm going to limit to the United States, Canada, and Bermuda, well, it becomes readily apparent just how poor Africa really is. So sub-Saharan Africa's combined GDP is $1.7 trillion. North America's, on the other hand, well, that's over 13 times higher, coming in at $22.5 trillion. Right? So now we have to ask ourselves, why is Africa so poor? So there are three major contributing factors, and they are Africa's economic and political institutions, Africa's chronic underdevelopment, and of course, colonialism's arbitrary borders. Acemoglu and Robinson state that many African societies are caught in a set of economic and political institutions which are not conducive to progress, and they continue to be caught in these same set of institutions to this day. Now they argue that Africa is stuck here because African cultures adopted centralized polities much later than their counterparts in other areas of the world, and they did it at a much less frequent rate. Then when they were adopted, these new polities were highly absolutist and patrimonial, and that these dimensions of the state inhibit economic development. Additionally, Africa's experiences in the Atlantic slave trade and colonization by the European powers directly prevented any internally driven reform that might have reversed Africa's economic and political backwardness, and they continue to prevent that progress today. The institutions that the European powers left behind when colonialism came to an end in the middle of the 20th century continue these trends today with poor property rights and absolutist and weak state institutions which show very little interest in providing for the public good. So, taking a slightly different starting point, Thompson offers a similar explanation for Africa's economic insecurity. He posits that European colonialism caused Africa's chronic underdevelopment, and that this is a significant driver for Africa's current economic woes. The colonial powers had systematically underdeveloped Africa in pursuit of their own economic interests. And then, after that, the colonial administrators failed to provide the solid economic foundations that colonial Africa would need when they achieved independence. Under imperial rule, the European powers developed with the wealth that was extracted from Africa, but then failed to develop African state infrastructure in return. Thompson also offers that African underdevelopment under colonialism falls, by and large, under three general processes. First, the exploitation of Africa's labor force through low wages, forced labor, and of course slavery. Second, resources and capital expropriated and removed out of Africa benefited the West and not Africans. Finally, the failure of the colonial administration to diversify the local economies. This systematic underdevelopment of the 19th and 20th centuries continues to hamper forward progress to this day. Collier and Gunning offer that the arbitrary borders laid down under colonialism also contribute to Africa's economic insecurity. For example, 16 states out of 55 in Africa are landlocked on all sides. These types of borders can often be a barrier to trade, even when the interstate relations are good. Additionally, many of these colonial mandated borders made for extremely small states. Small states typically have very small incomes and therefore making the state's economy even smaller. But compared to larger states, these small economies are disadvantaged. They are unable to meet an efficient economy of scale. They are perceived as riskier. They have relatively higher fixed costs, and they have smaller human capital. Finally, African exports tended to be commodities which are much more sensitive to market fluctuations than other trade goods. And that this colonial trend continues to this day. So in a downturn market, this is devastating to local economies. World Vision, a nonprofit organization which specializes in tackling the causes of poverty and injustice, estimates that as of 2019, 234 million sub-Saharan Africans were chronically undernourished, more than any other region on the planet. On the whole of Africa, 250 million people were experiencing hunger, which is nearly 20% of the population. While Africa should be poised to be the breadbasket of the world, what it really turns out to be is unfulfilled potential. According to The Economist magazine, Africa contains approximately 60% of the world's unused croplands. Unemployed and underemployed Africans could easily fill the millions of jobs that would be a byproduct of improved and expanded agriculture. So why, amid so much potential, is hunger still so prevalent? Well, it's here European colonialism continues to leave its stain. The corruption, greed, and labor exploitation which sprung from the European colonialism in Africa still shows today. Centered to hunger as a function of corruption is the issue of land tenure rights and tenure security in sub-Saharan Africa. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, customary land tenure rules, which govern how a land is used, and tenure security, which is the assurance a landholder has that their possession of the land in question is certain, are key to rural land development. To achieve land tenure security, however, farmers need access to trustworthy land administration services, affordable legal services, and honest, fair, and gender-neutral judicial services. These qualities are not always common in today's African judicial systems, just as they weren't under European colonialism. These poor and unfair policy choices of the colonial administrators and their legacy governments have done little to inspire Africa's farmers to invest in land improvements, and these lack of improvements go a long way towards keeping Africa hungry. Now, land rights aside, even if more land was cultivated, African farmers must still grow appropriate crops to feed the local population. J.H. Bernardin de Saint-Pierre said in 1769, "Coffee and sugar are not essential to the comfort of Africa, but I am certain that these two crops have brought wretchedness and misery to Africa." Colonial administrators forced cash crop on many African farmers during colonialism to help satisfy their monetary goals, as well as the desire of a burgeoning middle class in Europe, who were benefiting from industrialization. These cash crops of coca, coffee, sugar, peanuts, and cotton did much to fill the pockets of the Europeans, but they did little to fill the stomachs of Africans. Today, African countries still produce these same cash crops that they did during the 18th century. Structural adjustment programs, provided by many international lending institutions, compel much of Africa to adjust policies to fit into the world free market economy. An economy Africa has zero control over. What's the impact? Cash crops like the ones mentioned above must be grown versus the crops required to produce food Africans need. Food shortages are predicted over the next 30 years, with as many as 10 million starving to death. Structural adjustment programs are partially to blame. For community insecurity, I'd like to first revisit the UN Handbook for Human Security for a moment so we can go over what we mean by community security, or in our case, insecurity. Community security means freedom from interethnic, religious, or other identity-based tensions, crime, and terrorism. So with this definition in mind, let's look at the state of conflict in Africa. So as of 2017, and yes, I do understand that data from 2017 is a few years old, but as of 2017, there were 18 state-based conflicts. There were 50 non-state-based conflicts, and by non-state-based conflicts, I mean that the conflict was between two organized groups, none of which were associated with a state. So in addition to 18 and 50, there were also 15 one-sided conflicts. So clearly, conflict is still Africa's biggest problem, and by logical extension, community insecurity. So there's no way that I could ever cover all the different ways Africa's colonial legacy affects its current state of community security. There's just too many. So let's talk about the ones that stick out in my mind. First, let's revisit the topic of arbitrary borders. Now, when the European powers drew boundaries during the colonial era, they did so for reasons which best suited their economic interests, not the interests of African society. Most boundaries made little economic sense outside of the context of making Europeans wealthy. Significantly, Africa's new territorial borders paid little attention to existing political or social units. This left African states with two major problems to overcome: irredentism and caging. Irredentism is the desire for a single community to want to unite under a single flag after that community has been split up. So in our case, that would be by colonialism's arbitrary borders. The conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia in the 1970s is a classic textbook example of this irredentism-based community insecurity. The second major problem is what I call caging. Now, this is simply good old-fashioned ethnic conflict between two or more ethnic groups within the state. The arbitrary borders not only split up ethnic groups, they also put them together or cage them in they cage these different groups within a new state. So post-colonial state governments were forced to build or perhaps find government institutions which could peacefully resolve tensions between the groups. And this did not happen easily. Thompson gives the example of Tanzania when discussing quote-unquote caging, as Tanzania has more than 200 ethnic groups within its state. So next, let's look at colonial administration and their structural configuration styles as sources of community insecurity. So the British leveraged local indigenous elites already in place before colonialism to manage the affairs of their colonies. They did this through co-opting the locals and, when necessary, the use of coercion. These local authority figures were trained in basic administrative skills and then used to administer the daily affairs of the colony. Preserving the traditional patterns of social organization, the British used a divide and rule strategy and kept different ethnic groups from forming a coalition to oppose the colonial authorities. The British would then exploit these ethnic divisions and foster minority resentment, often choosing a marginalized ethnic group for British education or special status, say police, or civil service personnel. The British maintained control by stoking rivalries and building ethnic conflict into their system of colonial administration. The British then used a decentralized network of traditional authority to manage the colonial administrative duties within the colonies. Each group retained its own elite, and no specific group was subordinate to another. This left in place the leadership and structures needed to mobilize for collective action when driven by fear in the post-colonial periods. So finally, I'll talk about leadership. Now, there's little doubt that a state's leadership personality plays a tremendous role in the development of a state and how its executive is administered. Rodberg tells us that in the past 30 years alone, 90% of sub-Saharan African leaders have behaved like tyrants and governed poorly. And these traits, of course, lead to insecurity. I would argue that these types of leaders, these despots, while not exclusive to a post-colonial environment, are the products of environments that European colonialism shaped. Unstable states where conflict is the order of the day, and where weak economies and one-party political systems are the norm. As we move into our final category of human security, I'd like to pause to take a moment to visit the United Nations definitions of political security. We will define this as the freedom from political repression, human rights violations, and the rule of law and justice. The last sad irony of colonial rule in Africa is that as the European powers exited their colonies, they attempted to set up the liberal democratic processes that they had long denied their African subjects. The brand new constitutionally based institutions were meant to guarantee their former subjects pluralist representative governments and the rule of law. However, these institutions lacked historical roots in the practice of such political systems, and they were weak. Colonial institutions had been about authoritarianism and the control of their subjects, ruling through coercion and violence. It should be no surprise to anyone that these aspects of colonial legacy came to the surface post-colonialism, with state institutions becoming a major source of political repression. Hand in glove with the weak institutions which facilitated political repression and the absence of rule of law and justice are the state elites and leadership enablers. If we go back and look at colonial administration and their structural configuration styles, we can also see that they form a source of political insecurity. Under the French model of colonial rule, France forcefully integrated its colonies into a Greater France. The French administration pursued a centralized state, bringing all groups into one social system. Colonial law was typically left up to the colonial governor, and little was left to traditional local elites. Colonial agents replaced these local authorities, and the administrative power of the colony eroded traditional community bonds. The French went on to create new local elites and educated them in France. These new elites served as a counter to the old traditional authorities. However, new elite assimilation was not uniform across the colonies. Traditional homelands near the colonial capitals had greater access to these opportunities. The systems, institutions, and access remained unchanged as colonialism ended. Some groups remained in power to the political exclusion of others. Now, while violent conflicts in French colonies may have been less frequent due to the French methods of administration, French colonial legacy denied subordinate groups within the system legitimate, non-violent mechanisms for mobilization to address their grievances. Finally, we see the face of poor leadership again on these new state elites. With access to education and power limited to a very few individuals within post-colonial Africa, there was every reason to believe that the new elites would become every much the same as the imperial rulers. To conclude this presentation, I would ask that you look at the cartoon. Notice how I replaced the original labels on the backs of the Grim Reapers to reflect the categories of human security? Well, I think that this cartoon speaks volumes of the challenges facing Africa today. And while I stovepiped these categories and did not discuss them in relationship to one another, I don't see how it's possible to disconnect them or try to solve each individual challenge without addressing the whole through a comprehensive approach. I would encourage you to download and read through the UN Handbook on Human Security. It provides a unique perspective on what security means in the 21st century and was an interesting read for someone like me who grew up in the United States, never having to worry about these types of issues, and only thought about security in terms of power, even if it was considering the entire spectrum of power. So thank you for joining me today. I really do appreciate your time and your patience. And I'll close with the words of the late great Sean Connery. Here endeth the lesson.